The Beaumont estate occupied 3,000 acres along the eastern bank of the Mississippi, where the river bent southward through land so flat that standing water collected in the furrows between cotton rows for days after rain. The house itself was a structure of brick and timber, painted white each spring, with galleries on both floors that caught no breeze in summer. 47 enslaved persons worked the fields and maintained the household. Their quarters stood into rows beyond the kitchen garden, visible from the upper windows. Elijah worked in the house. He was 24 years of age, tall and silent, assigned to duties that required him to move through rooms where the family conducted their private affairs. He carried firewood, polished silver, and stood in corners during meals to refill glasses. His mother had worked in the same house until her death 3 years prior. He had been born on the property. Governor Charles Beaumont was frequently absent in Baton Rouge or New Orleans, attending to matters of state. His wife, Mrs. Adelaide Beaumont, was 31 years old, the daughter of a Charleston merchant who had lost his fortune to poor speculation. She had married the governor when she was 19. They had no children. The house was large and quiet during the governor's absences, which grew longer as his political ambitions expanded. Mrs. Beaumont kept detailed records of household expenditures in leather-bound ledgers. She conducted herself with the formality expected of a woman in her position. She attended church each Sunday at the Episcopal chapel in the nearest town, 7 miles distant. The enslaved persons who worked in the house spoke little in her presence. She did not raise her voice or strike anyone. She simply gave instructions and expected them to be followed. Elijah's tasks brought him into proximity with Mrs. Beaumont. Throughout each day, he lit the fire in her sitting room before dawn. He brought her breakfast tray. He stood outside the door when she received callers, waiting to show them out. The routine had been established years before and did not vary. The other enslaved persons in the house were older women who cooked and cleaned, and a girl of 14 named Patience, who assisted with Mrs. Beaumont's wardrobe and hair. They rose before sunrise and worked until the lamps were extinguished at night. Meals were eaten quickly in the kitchen. Conversation was brief and concerned only with tasks. There was no music on the Beaumont property. The governor did not permit it. In the spring of 1847, Mrs. Beaumont began requesting that Elijah attend to tasks in her private chambers during hours when such work was not customary. She would summon him in the afternoon to move furniture or adjust the position of a mirror. These requests came when the governor was in Baton Rouge for legislative sessions that lasted weeks. The older women in the kitchen noticed the irregularity but said nothing. Patience, who normally attended to Mrs. Beaumont's personal needs, was increasingly sent on errands to the quarters or the town. Elijah was given the evenings to himself less often. He was told to remain in the house after supper in case he was needed. Mrs. Beaumont's manner did not change in its outward form. She spoke to him in the same measured tone she used with all the household workers. But the nature of the requests grew stranger. She would ask him to bring her a book from the library downstairs, then tell him to read a passage aloud. She would claim to feel unwell and ask him to fetch water, then have him wait in the room while she drank it slowly. Elijah understood what was expected of him. He had lived his entire life in a system where his will was not his own. When Mrs. Beaumont made her intentions clear, there was no question of refusal. She was the wife of the governor. He was property. The law and custom and violence of the society in which they existed made resistance impossible. The first time occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. The governor had been gone for 12 days. Mrs. Beaumont locked the door to her chamber and closed the shutters. Afterward, She told Elijah to say nothing and to return to his duties. He went downstairs and polished the candlesticks in the dining room. His hands shook. He dropped one, and it dented. He hid the damage on the side that faced the wall. This pattern continued through May and into June. The governor returned for brief periods, during which Mrs. Beaumont's behavior reverted to its former formality. When he departed again, the summons resumed. Elijah lost weight. The cook, and woman named Miriam, who had known his mother, asked him if he was ill. He told her he was tired. She did not press further. By midsummer, the situation had become visible to others in the household, though no one spoke of it directly. Patients avoided looking at Elijah. The cook gave him larger portions at meals and asked no questions. The field workers who occasionally came to the kitchen for water or supplies sensed something wrong, but did not know its nature. Mrs. Beaumont grew bolder in her demands. She required Elijah's presence in her chambers several times each week. She gave him gifts: a shirt that had belonged to the governor, a book of poetry, a silver coin which he hid beneath the floorboards in the quarters. He knew that possessing such items could lead to accusations of theft. He could not refuse them. He could not keep them openly. The governor's visits home became shorter and less frequent. He was occupied with legislation concerning tariffs and a border dispute with Texas. When he was in residence, he spent his evenings in the library with correspondence and legal documents. He and Mrs. Beaumont took their meals together in silence. She complained of headaches. He prescribed fresh air and exercised in August. Mrs. Beaumont dismissed patients from her service and sent her to work in the fields. The girl had done nothing wrong. No explanation was given. Patients wept as she was led away by the overseer. The work in the fields was brutal, and she was not accustomed to it. She lasted for days before collapsing from heat and exhaustion. She was returned to the house and assigned to the laundry, with patients removed. Mrs. Beaumont required Elijah's attendance for tasks that were properly the domain of a lady's maid. She had him lace her corset and button her dresses. She asked him to brush her hair. These intimacies were performed in silence, in the locked chamber, with the shutters drawn. The summer heat made the room stifling. Elijah's humiliation was complete. He considered running. The border with the Republic of Texas was not impossibly distant, though the territory was contested and dangerous. Men who ran were hunted with dogs. If caught, they were whipped until the flesh hung in strips, then sold downriver to the sugar plantations where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. Elijah had seen this happen to others. He remained in September. Mrs. Beaumont realized she was with child. She told no one at first. She took to her bed, claiming illness. The cook prepared bland foods and sent them upstairs on trays. The governor, informed by letter, returned from Baton Rouge and summoned a physician from New Orleans. The physician examined Mrs. Beaumont and confirmed the pregnancy. The governor was pleased. He had long desired an heir. Mrs. Beaumont knew the child could not be her husband's. The governor had not shared her bed since the previous winter. She counted the months with growing panic. She stopped requesting Elijah's presence in her chambers. She avoided looking at him when he served at table. She spent hours in her sitting room, staring out the window at the river. The pregnancy advanced. By November, it could no longer be hidden beneath shawls and loose dresses. The governor made arrangements for a midwife. He commissioned a cradle from a carpenter in town. He wrote to his family in Virginia to share the news. Mrs. Beaumont grew pale and thin despite the child growing within her. She ate little. She slept poorly. Elijah continued his duties. He moved through the house like a ghost, the other enslaved. Persons gave him a wide berth. They understood, without being told, that he was entangled in something that would end badly. Miriam prayed over her cooking pot. Patience, still weak from her time in the fields, whispered to the others that judgment was coming. In December, Mrs. Beaumont went into labor. The midwife was summoned. The governor paced in the library. The household waited in tense silence. The labor lasted 14 hours. When the child was finally born, the midwife cleaned it and wrapped it in linen and carried it downstairs to show the governor. The child was a boy. His skin was light brown. His hair was tightly curled. There could be no mistaking his parentage. The governor looked at the infant for a long moment. He did not speak. He turned and walked out of the house. The midwife stood in the hallway, holding the baby, uncertain what to do. Upstairs, Mrs. Beaumont wept. The governor did not return to the house that night. He went to the overseer's quarters and remained there until morning. When he came back, his face was set like stone. He went directly to Mrs. Beaumont's chamber and shut the door. The household could hear raised voices, though not the words. The argument lasted an hour. When the governor emerged, he called for Elijah. Elijah was brought to the library. The governor sat behind his desk. He did not invite Elijah to sit. He asked, in a voice that trembled with restrained fury, if Elijah had violated his wife. Elijah stood silent. There was no answer he could give that would not result in his death. To admit the truth was to invite execution. To deny it was to call Mrs. Beaumont a liar, which would have the same result. The governor interpreted the silence as confession. He struck Elijah across the face with the back of his hand. The blow split Elijah's lip. Blood ran down his chin and dripped onto the carpet. The governor ordered him taken to the quarters and locked in the storage shed. He would decide his punishment. After further reflection, Elijah was confined in the shed for 3 days. He was given no food and only water once each day. The shed was not tall enough to stand in. He sat in darkness, listening to the sounds of the plantation outside. He knew he would die. The only question was how much he would suffer first. During those 3 days, Elijah began to remember details. He thought about the dates, the occasions, the locked doors. He thought about the gifts he had hidden, which bore Mrs. Beaumont's initials or the governor's name. He thought about Patience, who had been sent away so she would not witness what was happening. He thought about these things not because they would save him, but because he wanted to remember the truth clearly before the end. On the 4th day, the governor had him brought out, but instead of the whipping post, Elijah was taken to the road. A slave trader from Natchez was waiting with a wagon. Money changed hands. Papers were signed. Elijah was sold away from the only home he had ever known. The governor wanted him gone, not dead. A public execution would require an explanation. A sale required none. Mrs. Beaumont remained in her chamber for 2 weeks after the birth. The midwife, who had been paid handsomely for her services, left the estate and did not return. The child was given to a wet nurse, an enslaved woman who had recently borne her own infant. The wet nurse was instructed to care for the child in the quarters, away from the main house. The governor wrote to his family in Virginia and informed them that the child had died in birth. He wrote to acquaintances in Baton Rouge with the same message. A notice was placed in the New Orleans newspaper, announcing the tragic stillbirth of the Beaumont's first child. No funeral was held, as was sometimes the custom in such cases due to the delicate nature of the mother's health. Mrs. Beaumont emerged from her chamber in January. She appeared composed, though she had lost considerable weight. She resumed her duties as mistress of the house. She attended church, she received callers. No one spoke to her of the child. The few who had seen the infant, the midwife, the wet nurse, the cook knew better than to mention it. The governor returned to his political work with renewed focus. He introduced legislation concerning river navigation and tariffs. He gave speeches about the sanctity of property and the importance of order. His colleagues in the legislature noted that he seemed more severe than before, less inclined toward compromise or pleasantry. He did not speak of his personal affairs. In the quarters, the child grew. He was named Thomas by the wet nurse, who cared for him alongside her own son. The two boys played together in the dirt between the cabins. Thomas was lighter skinned than the other children, and his features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Mrs. Beaumont. The enslaved community understood his parentage without discussion. They protected him as they could, knowing he was evidence of something the governor wished to erase. Patience recovered from her ordeal in the fields, worked in the laundry, and said nothing of what she had observed. Miriam continued her duties in the kitchen and prayed. The other household workers maintained their silence. They had all lived long enough to know that the truth was not a shield. It was a weapon, and it could be turned against those who spoke it. 2 years passed. The governor's political career advanced. He was mentioned in newspapers as a potential candidate for higher office. Mrs. Beaumont remained at the estate, keeping her distance from the quarters where Thomas lived. She never acknowledged him. She conducted herself as a woman who had suffered a private tragedy and borne it with dignity. In the spring of 1849, a journalist from New Orleans arrived at the estate. He was writing a profile of the governor for a periodical concerned with Southern politics and culture. He was given a tour of the grounds and an interview in the library. During his visit, he saw Thomas playing in the yard near the quarters. The resemblance to Mrs. Beaumont was striking enough that he remarked upon it to the overseer. The overseer, a man named Pritchard who had been with the Beaumonts for 15 years, told the journalist that Thomas was the child of a house servant and had no connection to the family. The journalist, sensing something irregular, made inquiries in town. He spoke with the midwife, who was reluctant to discuss the matter. He spoke with tradesmen who supplied the estate. He heard rumors. The journalist did not publish what he learned. He was not a crusading reformer. He understood the social order and the consequences of challenging a man of the governor's position. But he mentioned his observations in correspondence with other journalists and editors. The story spread quietly through certain circles, not as scandal, but as gossip, unverified and unconfirmed. In 1850, a political rival of the governor obtained testimony from the wet nurse. She was questioned by men who offered her no protection and made her no promises. She told them what she knew. The child had been born to Mrs. Beaumont. The governor had been absent for months prior to the birth, and the child's appearance made his parentage obvious. The testimony was recorded but not made public immediately. It was held as leverage. The governor became aware that his secret was known. He took steps to secure the silence of those involved. The wet nurse was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Pritchard was dismissed and given money to relocate to Texas. The midwife died under circumstances that were not investigated closely. The journalist from New Orleans published his profile of the governor without mention of Thomas or the events of 1847. The article praised the governor's leadership and vision. Thomas remained in the quarters, now 4 years old, unaware of the forces arranging themselves around his existence. He was a quiet child, unusually watchful for his age. The other enslaved persons treated him with a mixture of pity and caution, knowing he was both powerless and dangerous to those who protected him. In 1851, the governor's political rival released the wet nurse's testimony to a newspaper editor sympathetic to his faction. The account was published in a Baton Rouge paper, not as proven fact but as allegation worthy of investigation. The governor denied the claims. Mrs. Beaumont issued no statement. The matter became a subject of debate in political circles, but without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, it remained unresolved. The governor did not seek higher office. He completed his term and retired from public life. He sold the Beaumont estate and moved with Mrs. Beaumont to Mobile, where they lived in a modest house near the waterfront. They were no longer received in the homes of the prominent families they had once called friends. Mrs. Beaumont's health declined. She died in 1854 of causes the physician described as consumption and melancholy. She was 40 years of age. The governor outlived her by 7 years. He spent his final years writing a memoir that was never published. In it, he did not mention the child or the scandal. He died in 1861, as the nation fractured into war. His estate was settled by distant relatives who had no interest in revisiting old allegations. Thomas was sold at auction in 1853, when the estate was liquidated. The buyer was a cotton factor from Vicksburg. There is no further record of him. He would have been 7 years old. What became of him after that sale is unknown. He disappeared into the vast and brutal machinery of enslavement that consumed millions of lives, and kept no careful accounting of their fates. The Elijah, sold away in 1847, was taken to Natchez and resold to a sugar plantation in the Delta country south of New Orleans. The conditions there were harsh. Records indicate he died in 1850 during a yellow fever outbreak that killed 40 persons on the property in the span of 3 weeks. He was 31 years old. The plantation where these events occurred was purchased after the war by a shipping concern. The house burned in 1879. The quarters were torn down. The land was subdivided and sold to tenant farmers. By the end of the century, nothing remained to mark the location where the Beaumont family had lived and where their ruin had unfolded. The story survived in fragments in court records related to the estate sale, in the unpublished memoir of the governor, in the memories of those who had heard rumors but knew better than to speak them aloud. It was not a story of heroism or redemption. It was a record of power exercised without restraint, of lives destroyed by circumstances they could not control, and of a system that protected its own by erasing evidence and silencing witnesses. What remains is this account, assembled from those fragments, preserved not as inspiration but as testament to what occurred when the law made human beings into property and gave certain persons absolute authority over others. The consequences were recorded imperfectly, but they were real. The suffering was not ennobled by its documentation. It simply happened, and then it was forgotten.